Welcome. I'm Kinetic Symphony. I hunt down and report on weird and mysterious stories, from glitches to the paranormal. Case file number 793, written by AnimatedMajor, Glimpsing the Apocalypse. So this story is about 20 years old now. I'm 40, I was 20 at the time. I remember it very clearly, as does my mother. We were on a trip from Utah to California, passing into San Diego. The trip has an overpass that we pass under, and we have made that trip 1,000 times over the course of my life. We always use that overpass to signify the start or end of the trip, depending on which way we are going. So this trip had been grueling. We had a lot of car trouble, and had been harassed by California border agents because they caught us with ferrets once, a few years earlier. So they regularly demanded to search our car in case we were smuggling wild animals. With that in mind, we were ready to get home. It was hitting sunset as we approached the city. We passed under the landmark overpass, and my mom sighed and said, "We're home." And I cheered and went back to listening to music. It usually took about 45 minutes from the overpass to get to our doorstep. After roughly half an hour of driving, we both started getting confused. We were passing under freeways that we wouldn't normally pass under. I started looking around to see if we had missed something when my mom said, "What is that?" And I saw something to this day that makes my head dizzy when I think too hard about it. The buildings around us were crumbling, and the freeways over us had vines and stuff hanging from them. I audibly gasped, and my mom just started saying, "What the hell, what the hell, what the hell?" Then it was dark, and we were on the freeway, and we were passing under the overpass, except we were going the wrong way, heading out of the city instead of coming in. My mom freaked out, pulled over, and started freaking out even more. I couldn't even think clearly. We were both just unable to cope with what we had seen, or where we were. We realized we were missing a couple hours, and we eventually just said it was a shared hallucination and she had been driving in a daze because of the long day. To this day, we both cannot explain what we saw or justify how we ended up on the freeway heading out of the city. I recently brought it up to my mother, and she got really quiet and said she remembered, told me what she remembered, which matched my memories, and wouldn't talk about it further. She refused to speculate or discuss it any further than the cold hard fact of, this happened. This is what happened. That's it. That was probably the craziest glitch I've ever seen. Take it as you will, or don't. It doesn't matter to me. Case notes for file 793, Glimpsing the Apocalypse. So damn, this is a bit topical now, with the constant threat of nuclear Armageddon being a reality. I don't want to be a bummer, and I don't think that'll come to pass, at least not in this universe, but it is a distinct possibility, at least in the grand scheme of the multiverse. If it did happen, quantum immortality, we'd just zip to a better universe, hopefully. It's one of those branching paths that humanity might walk down, or stumble down, idiotically. Let's not be part of the Great Barrier for the Fermi Paradox. We can rise above that, I hope. But that does seem to be what happened. You glimpsed into a parallel universe, either in the future, probably a timeline glitch, but it could just be a parallel universe where things already fell apart pretty well, you know? Maybe just in that local area there was a nuclear device that dropped. There's also neutron bombs that don't really devastate the infrastructure as much, but they just kill people. Either way though, it's just terrible to think about. I can understand being freaked out for sure. Of course, this happened 20 years ago, so it wouldn't be related to today's events, but still, it's within a time period that is small enough where these things can just happen. Wasn't that long ago that the Cuban Missile Crisis was on us, and we were saved from nuclear Armageddon by the decision of one general, so, you know, sometimes one choice really does make a difference. Case file number 794, written by Rosssetti, Telepathy between mother and daughter. Yesterday, my daughter, 2.5 years old, was playing with a rather large hawk feather my husband has had around for years. She had been playing with it for a bit while I was writing a paper on my computer, not looking up, but just noticing her out of the corner of my eye. Did you guys know that the tweet was going around a while back, went something like, "When he tickles you with a bird leaf, I love it." And then someone responds, "You harlot, you mean a feather?" So I thought in my head to say, "What you got there, kiddo? A bird leaf?" Huh. But I stopped myself, because I wouldn't want to confuse her and get her in the habit of calling it a bird leaf. I hadn't even spoken yet, just had the thought, and my 2-year-old says, "No, Mommy, it's not a bird leaf, it's a feather." There's no way in the world she has ever heard the term bird leaf before. There's no explanation other than a telepathic moment between mother and daughter. Case notes for file 794. Telepathy between mother and daughter. People often associate children with a heightened sense of awareness, like a third eye, that's not fully mellowed out or blocked out by age. And that's the thing, as adults, we have so many mental filters that build up over time because the world is infinitely complex, and without those filters, we'd go crazy. The older you get, the more filtered and processed it becomes, which can be very useful, of course, but it does murk things out, I guess you could say. So, along those lines, I guess, your child was able to connect to your mental state telepathically, but very precisely, knowing 2 specific words that they had no business possibly knowing. A bird leaf. That's funny too, I like that. Case file number 795, written by 17 Demon Jerks, stepping into another universe. This happened when I was around 18 or 19, but I remember it vividly because of how jarring and confusing it was. I've had a few odd experiences with dreams, but nothing in the middle of the day like this. So when this happened, I was still living at home with my parents, and we lived in my childhood home. This home was pretty much all I ever knew, as we moved there when I was 3 years old. I had a habit of going on daily walks in the nearby park, something I did nearly every single day since I was 14 or 15 years old, up until I moved out. It was a summer, around 1 to 2 p.m., and I went to leave the house for one of my walks. I slipped my shoes on and went to open the door as usual. But when I stepped out of the house and looked up, my neighborhood felt completely wrong. It didn't exactly look different. Everything looked exactly the same as it usually did. The small ravine next to our house, the tree in the front yard, the steep driveway, and our neighbors' houses, all of it looked completely normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something really wrong and different with it all. It felt as if reality was warped or something. I stood on my front porch for a minute or so, trying to figure out what felt so incredibly wrong with my neighborhood. After a while, though, I figured I was just being silly and made my way down to the driveway. When I was about halfway down, my neighbor, who was tending to his garden across the street, looked up towards me, stared at me as if he saw a ghost, his face going completely pale, and opened his mouth to speak. Before I could even stare at him in confusion, before he had gotten a single word out, I was back inside my own house at my front door about to leave. I was completely shaken. I had no idea how I ended up back in my front door. I had no idea what I just experienced, and when I pulled the door open, it was completely normal. Nothing felt wrong anymore. It was all glaringly normal. The only difference was when I opened my front door again, my neighbor was not out front gardening. I decided not to go for a walk that day. Years later, I have no idea what I experienced, and as weird as it sounds, the part that freaks me out the most is how wrong my neighborhood felt despite looking exactly the same. So, between the weird teleportation back indoors and my neighbor acting as if he was staring at a ghost, the feeling of wrongness is the thing that bothers me the most. I don't know how to explain it. I didn't feel unsafe, it didn't feel dreadful, it just felt like I was looking at a completely different version of my neighborhood at that moment, and I don't think I will ever forget it. I've never really told anyone about this as I'm usually a pretty skeptical person, but I've had no way to explain this. Case notes for file 795, stepping into another universe. The way you describe your neighbor looking at you, it's almost as if he saw a ghost. And I think this could all be related. I think when we're seeing ghosts or echoes or spirits, however we describe it, they're there, but slightly out of phase with our dimension. And if you're able to see them, you're just closer to our dimension. It's a gradient, not exactly a one step in, one step out. When we're talking about dimensions, you can have slight overlap, and it just looks wrong. And I think that's what your neighbor was sensing. And you were sensing it too, not exactly that your neighborhood was wrong, it's that you weren't in sync with the reality itself. So the neighborhood was normal, but you were out of sync. and you felt it. Even though you couldn't visually see it, you just knew something was entirely wrong. It might even be a quantum immortality thing. You were slightly dying, but not all the way yet, and your spirit was slightly being attuned, being pulled away, I guess you could say, slowly. And that would explain how you teleported back inside and just was a different universe, so you didn't realize it. You weren't actually physically moving in space-time, you just were in a different universe. In the great multiverse. But that means that your neighbor actually did see you sort of out of phase, I guess as a spirit, as a ghost, as we would describe it. That's an experience for your neighbor, especially in broad daylight.